Our next speaker, Federico Santangelo from Newcastle. I invited Federico, in fact, to come and speak, if he would, about Caesarism, and he is going to do exactly that, but also about Gramsci, I think, from Paris to Turi, constructions of Caesarisms. So, over to you, Federico.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this introduction and for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here today. I shall try to contribute to our discussion on the Roman dictatorship between antiquity and modern times by offering some thoughts on a strand of modern political culture that has a close, demonstrable, and yet controversial link with ancient history and ancient political thought: Caesarism. And the title of my talk, as you can see, evokes two places where key moments of the reflection on Caesarism took place. Paris, where the word Caesarism was first coined in the late 1840s, and Turi, a small town in the vicinity of Bari, in southern Italy, where the Italian communist militant and philosopher Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned between 1928 and 1933, and where he produced some groundbreaking work on politics, power, consent, opposition, nation building, and indeed on Caesarism. My focus would be on personal regimes rather than on the modern legacy of Roman Republican dictatorships, in the plural, but the ghost of Roman Republican politics will never be, I think, very far from sight. As is well known, the word Caesarism has two fundamental meanings. It may define a set of political conducts that lead to a monarchic or tyrannical outcome and override a republican setup in which power is more or less broadly distributed. Yet, the word Caesarism can also carry a more abstract meaning, which pertains to the plane of ideology. An attempt to theorize a regime that revolves around a political and military leader, and to assert its desirability or historical necessity. And this is the shade of Caesarism in which I am interested today. I'm quite aware, though, that the interplay between historical practice and ideological developments is ever more complex than straightforward definitions would suggest. The notion of Caesarism framed a series of attempts to think about politics and power through the historical experience and example of Julius Caesar, which came to the fore in the mid-1800s and had considerable resonances well into the 20th century. The earliest known occurrence of the term is in a book by a man called Auguste Romieux, L'Ère de César, published in 1850, in which the notion of Caesarism, is codified as a new political concept that was already immanent, in Romieux's view, in contemporary politics. It is neither royalty nor empire or despotism or tyranny, to use Romieux's words. It is the general shape of the imminent future, la forme générale de l'avenir très prochain. A future that will consist of a series of military monarchies that, unlike traditional monarchies, will not be based on faith, but on a rational use of force, and will bring about order and stability after the rule of the mob or after a spell of civil war. Yet, in Romieux's view, the Caesarist equilibrium will not be a stable one. What Romieux envisages is actually a sequence of masters struggling for hegemony. Romieux made a point of using the notion of Caesarism, in a neutral sense, or at least in a factual one. His stated ambition was to spell out the logic of modern times and to make a positive case for a regime based on military force and its historical inevitability. Far from being an isolated instance, this feature, this tract of the Strait of Romeo's analysis, belongs in a strong intellectual tradition that makes the case for military dictatorships in France all the way until the 1940s. It's a prominent strand of French political culture. Within a few years of the appearance of Romeo's book, the word Caesarism was taken up in a number of European languages. Caesarism, Caesarismus, or Caesarianismus, Caesarismo. Most of the early occurrences of the word, though, are far less positive than is the case in Romeo's work, and are usually referred to the regime of Napoleon III. The emperor didn't actually actively promote it, but associations between his regime and the Caesar, and indeed a Caesarist ideology, lent themselves fairly easily. Even Napoleon I, after all, had been a keen student of Caesar's work since the days of his officer training, and at St. Helena he wrote a tract on the wars of Caesar that still repays close reading and clearly attracts a sizable readership in our own time. 2 English translations appeared in 2018. Napoleon III was the author of a full-scale Histoire de Jules César, in which he showed genuine enthusiasm for the subject matter and for learned, erudite research, and for which he sought the help of individuals such as Prosper Mérimée and William Frenaire. He also approached Mommsen, but to no avail. An association between Napoleon III and Caesarism was therefore tempting and for many unproblematic. Others, however, took issues with it. An abrasive attack to the whole notion of Caesarism came from Karl Marx in the preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written in 1869. I hope that my work will contribute towards eliminating the school-taught phrase, now current, particularly in Germany, of so-called Caesarism. In this superficial historical analogy, the main point is forgotten, namely that in ancient Rome the class struggle took place only within a privileged minority, between the free rich and the free poor, while the great productive mass of the population, the slaves, formed the purely passive pedestal for these combatants. People forget Sismondi's significant saying, Sismondi, a great economic historian, the Roman proletariat lived at the expense of society, while modern society lives at the expense of the proletariat. With so complete a difference between the material, economic conditions of the ancient and the modern class struggles, the political figures produced by them can likewise have no more in common with one another than the Archbishop of Canterbury has with the High Priest Samuel. End of quote. In the first edition of the 18th Brumaire, Marx had already criticized facile analogies between Roman Republican history and modern politics. Here, as you can see, his attack became both more focused and more abrasively sarcastic, even by his standards. Marx's work was very influential in many respects, but it certainly did not reach the aim of closing down the debate on Caesarism, which went on to involve some of the liveliest and most original political minds of the second half of the 19th century, from Giuseppe Mazzini to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Carlo Cattaneo, commanding varying degrees of engagement, assent, and dissent. It acquired even greater significance in the new age of revolutions of the first quarter of the 20th century. It had, for example, a prominent role in the work of Max Weber. And by the early 1930s, the productive ambiguity and sheer potential of the notion of Caesarism was very clear to the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, who developed it in a highly original and productive way. Gramsci had been a militant and a journalist, first in the Italian Socialist Party, then in the Communist Party. He was born in 1891, politically active already from the mid-1910s. He took part in the founding of the Italian Communist Party in 1921. An opposition MP since 1924, he was arrested in 1926 and shortly afterwards sentenced to over 20 years in prison by a special tribunal set up by the fascist regime. The harsh conditions of his detention had a devastating impact on his already frail health. He died in 1937, a mere few days after the end of his sentence. For several years, he was denied by the prison administration any access to pen and paper, except for private correspondence with close family members. From February 1929, when he was allowed at last to use some, he started producing a vast body of notes on cheap notebooks, in which he tackled a series of major political and intellectual problems. The outcome was a set of manuscripts, Quaderni del Carcere, the prison notebooks, which were brought into the public domain after his death, largely thanks to the ingenuity and courage of his sister-in-law, Tatiana Schucht. It's a polycentric, philologically demanding and unfinished body of work, and yet it readily emerged as one of the most important contributions to political thought in the 20th century, whose significance exceeds the boundaries of Marxism. Caesarism was a major focus of interest for Gramsci, to which he returned on a number of occasions in the drafting of the notebooks, especially between 1932 and 1933. Gramsci had a less than superficial familiarity with the ancient world, as may be expected of someone who had gone through the Italian Liceo Classico in the early 20th century. He had read and studied Caesar in the original Latin and had been struck by the image that Caesar had projected of himself in his own literary works. He had also read Mommsen's Roman history, as any well-educated man of his generation could be expected to have done, and ostensibly he subscribed to the image of Caesar as the leader of the Popularis faction and as a political leader who had built his rise on the support of the people and on a consistent opposition to the senatorial oligarchy. As a young man, he had been a prolific and highly talented theatre critic. In the review of a production of Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra he had attended in June 1919 in Turin, he commented mainly on the plot and on the ways in which the characters were constructed. Shaw's Caesar is a, quote, simple and plain, unquote, figure who could not be further apart from the portrayal of Caesar sketched by Shakespeare in Gramsci's assessment. That is the most noteworthy aspect of the play, and one that is likely to be lost on most of its Italian audience. Shaw's Caesar, Gramsci goes on, is stripped of any tragic features. He's a great man and a great statesman alike. And then a striking historical judgment ensues. He is great in all of his pursuits, as the historical Caesar, quote, truly was, as he was depicted by the ancient historians, as he reveals himself from his candid books of memoirs, which are among the masterpieces of Roman literature for their candor and simple frankness, unquote. Caesar and his literary work receive a positive mention in the first notebook, in a context where Gramsci sketches the preliminary stages of his reflection on political and military leadership. I'm here using the English translation of the late Joseph Buttigieg, the father of Pete, the Democratic presidential hopeful. Military leadership must always be subordinated to political leadership. That is, army command must always be a military expression of a particular policy. Naturally, it may be the case that the politicians are worthless, while in the army there are commanders who combine military skill with political skill, Such is the case with Caesar and Napoleon. But in Napoleon's case, one can see how the change of policy, together with the presumption of possessing a military instrument, which was military in the abstract, led to his downfall. In other words, even in these instances of political and military leadership united in the same person, politics was more important than military leadership. Caesar's books, especially the Bello Chiuili, are a classic example of the display of a wise combination of politics and military art. Soldiers saw in Caesar not only a great military leader, but also a great political leader. And then he then goes on to reflect on Bismarck's take on the primacy of politics over the military. Let us not overlook the very simple fact that Gramsci is reflecting, of course, on the very roots of the defeat of his own movement, and more generally of the anti-fascist movement between the late 1920s and the early 1930s. That is the backdrop of this reflection on the interplay between the political and the military dimensions, which of course remains a major focus of Gramsci's interest later on, notably in Notebook 13, written between May 1932 and November 1933, where he tackles the problem of political leadership through the prism of Caesarism, and where he puts forward an original development of the theory of Caesar. Caesar, Napoleon I, Napoleon III, Cromwell, etc. He starts off with a note to self, as you can see. Compile a catalogue of the historical events which have culminated in a great heroic personality. Caesarism can be said to express a situation in which the forces in conflict balance each other in a catastrophic manner. That is to say, they balance each other in such a way that a continuation of the conflict can only terminate in the reciprocal destruction. When the progressive force A struggles with the reactionary force B, not only may A defeat B or B defeat A, but it may happen that neither A nor B defeats the other, that they bleed each other mutually. And then a third force, C, intervenes from outside, subjugating what is left of both A and B. In Italy, after the death of Lorenzo il Magnifico, 1492, this is precisely what occurred. And I shall come back to this tension between the reflection of Caesarism and nation building in a moment. But Caesarism, although it always expresses this particular solution, the particular solution, in which a great personality is entrusted with the task of arbitration, between inverted commas, over a historical political situation characterized by an equilibrium of forces heading towards catastrophe, does not in all cases have the same historical significance. And here is an original, innovative twist in Gramsci's reflection on Caesarism. There can be both progressive and regressive forms of Caesarism. The exact significance of each form can, in the last analysis, be reconstructed only through concrete history and not by means of any sociological rule of thumb. Caesarism is progressive when its intervention helps the progressive force to triumph, albeit with its victory tempered by certain compromises and limitations. It is regressive when its intervention helps the regressive force to triumph, in this case too with certain compromises and limitations, which have, however, a different value, extent, and significance than in the former. Caesar and Napoleon I are examples of progressive Caesarism, Napoleon III and Bismarck of regressive Caesarism. So as you can see from this extensive, dense, and I hope not entirely useless quote, in Gramsci's discussion of Caesarism, Julius Caesar plays a much more central role than he had played in Romieux's reflection, or indeed in the reflection of other thinkers that had been engaging with the problem of Caesarism. He is singled out as the figurehead of one of the two breeds of Caesarism that Gramsci identifies in history. And yet, as you can see, no formal definition is given of the terms that make Caesar's Caesarism progressive. One consideration appears to be crucial. Caesar and Napoleon I embarked on a form of Caesarist project that was both quantitative and qualitative, to use Gramsci's terms, and led to a comprehensive change of the shape itself of the state. What Gramsci terms a complete upheaval, completo rivolgimento. The action of Napoleon III, on the contrary, involved a power shift, but no significant change in the structure of the state, and no broadening of the political and social constituency that supported and benefited from the new political setup. There are, I think, two more points of Gramsci's analysis, as it's formulated in this classic passage. They resonate strongly with a student of the Roman Republic. On the one hand, Gramsci is resorting to the image of a catastrophic scenario, which must necessarily lead to a monarchic outcome and to the implosion of a Republican setup. One is reminded of a strand of ancient and modern historiography that views the end of the Republic as the necessary outcome of a political dynamic that was no longer sustainable, as the outcome of a crisis without alternatives. On the other hand, the arbitral role of the Caesar, not just of Julius Caesar, that Gramsci envisages is closely reminiscent of a certain way of constructing the dictatorship, the Roman dictatorship, as a setup that resolves political tensions by bringing in a new settlement. And that's a tension that, as Catherine Steele has just reminded us, is central to much of the agenda of Sulla's dictatorship, and which can be regarded as central to the brief of any lawmaker. One could perhaps speculatively be reminded of the Aisumnetai of the early Greek polis. Even from the depths of the prison where he was confined, Gramsci was acutely aware of the place that ancient Rome, and specifically Julius Caesar, had in the public discourse and propaganda of the fascist regime, and how the celebration of the glories of ancient Rome was entwined with a powerful nationalistic narrative. In the autumn of 1933, he came across a speech that a man called Emilio Bodrero, then Deputy Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies and a philosophy professor at the University of Padua, had given at the inauguration ceremony of a statue of Julius Caesar in Rimini. Personal gift of the Duce to the city, removed after the liberation and tellingly relocated in an army barracks called Julius Caesar in Rimini itself. Anyway, Gramsci read the Bodrero's speech in the Nuova Antologia, in a major journal of the time, and he found plenty of scope for disagreement. The theory of Caesarism, which predominates today, see the speech of Emilio Bodrero, L'umanità di Giulio Cesare, was introduced into the political language by Napoleon III. Strictly speaking, that's not quite correct, but it was introduced into the political language by Napoleon III, who was certainly neither a great historian nor a philosopher or a political theorist. Certainly, in Roman history, the figure of Caesar is not only or principally characterized by Caesarism in this narrow sense. The historical development expressed by Caesar assumes within the Italian peninsula, i.e. in Rome, the form of Caesarism. But its framework is the entire imperial territory and actually consists of the denationalization of Italy and its subordination to the interests of the empire. Nor did Caesar transform Rome from a city-state into the capital of the empire, as Bodrero says. That's an absurd and unhistorical contention. The capital of the empire was wherever the emperor resided, a mobile point. The crystallization of a capital led to a fissure, to the emergence of Constantinople, of Milan, etc. Rome became a cosmopolitan city, and the whole of Italy became the center of a cosmopolis. A comparison between Catiline and Caesar should be made. There's a new twist in his reflection. Catiline was more Italian than Caesar, and his revolution would have perhaps enabled Italy to retain, under a new ruling class, the hegemonic function it had during the Republican period. With Caesar, the revolution is no longer the resolution of a struggle among Italian classes, but among empire-wide ones, or at least among classes that had chiefly imperial functions, military men, bureaucrats, bankers, contractors. From a cultural standpoint, the present myth of Caesar is interesting. It has no historical basis whatsoever, just as the 18th century exaltation of the Roman Republic as a popular and democratic institution, etc. The focus of this note is to set the place of Caesar in the history of Caesarism, and Gramsci points out that Caesar's historical impact is not best understood through the prism of Caesarism, through the lenses of Caesarism. Not only and not mainly through it, anyway. While it is true that in Rome and in Italy, a Caesarist trend steered the main political developments, the fundamental driver of change played out on larger imperial scale and was the integration of Italy within the empire and its eventual subordination to the interests of the empire. Moreover, the conquest of Gaul fundamentally altered the balance of the empire and paved the way for a long-standing tension between West and East that, in Gramsci's view, was going to carry on until the schism of 1054. Gramsci makes two related points on the back of this synthetic assessment. The pace of history changed very significantly within the space of a generation, in the mid-1st century BC. In Catiline's time, the terms of the situation were rather different, and the horizon of the conspiracy was unmistakably Italian, or Italic. The elite that would have emerged had the conspiracy prevailed would have been an Italian elite. The context of Caesar's victory was altogether different. And then, as you can see, Gramsci notes that the present myth of Caesar has no historical basis whatsoever. Caesarism clearly is a category that carries some analytical value and is partly relevant to the understanding of Caesar's time too. But the historical study of Caesar must be based on different premises to the, back then, current focus on the greatness of the individual, Caesar as an individual. In one important respect, this assessment is closely, if implicitly, aligned with the scaling view of the myths of Republican Rome that we saw in Marx's 18th Brumaire. Gramsci, however, has a fundamentally different analytical focus to Marx's in this context. He views Julius Caesar's Caesarism as a turning point in the history of Italy and in the integration of the Roman Empire. He establishes a link between the rise of monarchy and the creation of a political and economic structure that encompasses the whole of the Mediterranean world and redefines the role of Rome and Italy within it. He is here, and also in other notes on this problem in the notebooks, altogether uninterested in the constitutional dimension of the problem. He never refers to Caesar as a dictator, alas, and does not once probe the terms of his magisterial powers. His chief concern is to explore how the emergence of a new monarchic force marked a shift towards what he terms the denationalization of Italy. By becoming the center of an empire, Italy also becomes an attractive focus for migration, notably of intellectuals, towards Rome. The central problems of Gramsci's construction of Caesar's Caesarism are then about two major long-term problems: the position of Italy within the empire, within the Roman Empire, and the emergence of what he terms a cosmopolitan strand in Italian culture, in Italian intellectual life, which has a strong impact, in his view, on the difficulties and delays and discontents in the formation of the nation-state in Italy, and indeed of a national conscience. To use somewhat emphatic language, one could argue that, in Gramsci's view, the Roman Empire had been a sort of poison chalice, really, to Italy and to its long-term historical trajectory. And Caesar had played a crucial role in that development. Yet Gramsci was too profound a thinker for settling for such a unidimensional account. the lack of a coherent national tradition in the long-term history of Italy opened up, in his view, formidable opportunities. It exposed Italy to what he terms a cosmopolitan outlook, an openness to the world, and its complexity that no other national culture could match. In placing such strong emphasis on the cosmopolitan dimension of Italian culture, Gramsci is not just thinking of Italian intellectuals and their global reach. He is also reflecting on the extent and scope of Italian emigration between the late 1800s and the first quarter of the 20th century. And the poignancy of that point in the context of nationalistic statolatry that dominated 1930s Italy is apparent. We have come quite a long way from mid-1st century BC Rome, or so it seems. Gramsci's Caesarism is a highly productive intellectual construction, which should be first and foremost assessed on the plane of political thought. And yet, dismissing its ability to set major historical problems into focus and to point towards productive avenues of explanation and inquiry would be, I think, a hasty choice. Its fundamental contention is worth spelling out by way of conclusion. I would argue that it still has much to offer to the debate. Caesar's progressive Caesarism, to use Gramsci's terminology, is a defining phase in the history of the Roman Empire and of Roman imperialism. It reframes the role of Rome and reshapes the ways in which Italy comes to reap the rewards of an empire in which it is central. Its position within the empire and the impact of the creation of the empire on the Italian peninsula remain a major focus of the study of the Roman world to this day. Exciting new ongoing work on the Roman imperial economy, on material culture, on mobility within the empire and beyond is seeking to explore these very problems. Gramsci's assessment of the impact of Caesarism on late Republican Rome invites us to look away from Caesar and to focus our attention on the ties and the tensions between monarchic power and imperial integration, to think harder about the empire and most notably about the role of Italy within it. Arguably, the version of Caesarism sketched by Gramsci does not make a substantial contribution to an historical reading of Julius Caesar, but it is a distinctive and effective chart of problems and perspective towards a wider historical reading of the Roman Republic, and I hope to have convinced you that early 21st century students of this period would do well not to overlook it. It's an opportunity to think harder about some of our material and possibly also about the ethos of our trade. Thank you very much.